In 1819, America faced a collapse so sudden it erased fortunes overnight and shattered the dreams of an entire generation. This was not war, not invasion, but something far more invisible and far more devastating. If you think financial crises are modern, think again. This was America's first economic disaster, and it exposed a system no one truly understood. What happened next would define the nation's future. In the next 15 minutes, you'll see how easy money turned into mass foreclosure, who caused it, and why the same pattern keeps repeating even today. After the War of 1812, the United States emerged with renewed confidence and a hunger for expansion. The nation believed its future was limitless. Land stretched endlessly westward, and Americans rushed to claim it, believing prosperity was guaranteed. Opportunity felt closer than ever before. Banks began offering easy credit, allowing ordinary citizens to borrow money they never had. Debt quietly became the engine of expansion. Farmers bought land, speculators bought more, and prices rose faster than anyone expected. It seemed like a system that could never fail. But beneath the surface, this growth depended on something fragile: confidence. And confidence, once broken, can collapse everything. The nation was expanding rapidly, but its financial system was still young and unstable. Few understood the risks they were taking. This was America on the edge, growing fast, borrowing heavily, and trusting a system no one fully controlled. The stage was set for disaster. What looked like prosperity was, in reality, a delicate balance built on borrowed money. And soon, that balance would break. America's first great financial experiment was underway, and no one knew how it would end. At the center of this system stood the Second Bank of the United States, tasked with stabilizing the economy. Instead, it fueled the boom. Under the leadership of William Jones, the bank expanded credit rapidly across the country. Loans became easier than ever to obtain. Paper money flooded the economy, creating the illusion of wealth where little truly existed. The system was growing faster than its foundation. At the same time, cotton exports surged, especially to Europe, driving massive profits for American farmers. Demand seemed endless. Land prices skyrocketed as speculation intensified, and buyers rushed in, fearing they would miss out. Greed began to replace caution. But this prosperity was built on borrowed money, not real productivity. The entire system depended on constant growth. Across the nation, Americans believed wealth was finally within reach, and borrowing became a normal part of everyday life. Few questioned how long this surge could last. Banks issued loans freely, often without strict oversight, creating a system filled with risk, but hidden beneath confidence. The warning signs were already there. Speculators bought land not to farm, but to resell quickly at higher prices, driving values even further upward. The market was fueled by expectation, not reality. Even ordinary farmers took on large debts, trusting that rising prices would secure their future. It felt like a rare chance no one could afford to miss. But behind the scenes, the financial system was becoming dangerously overstretched. Too much money had been created without enough real backing. The economy depended on continuous expansion, and any disruption could trigger a collapse. Yet almost no one was prepared for that possibility. International markets began to shift, and demand for American goods started to weaken quietly. The first cracks were forming beneath the surface. Cotton prices, once soaring, began to fall, cutting deeply into the profits of American farmers. The foundation of the boom was starting to crumble. As profits declined, debts became harder to repay, and the pressure on borrowers increased rapidly. Confidence began to fade. Banks noticed the shift and began to grow cautious, tightening credit after years of easy lending. The flow of money slowed. Loans were suddenly called in, forcing borrowers to repay debts they could no longer afford. The system began turning against itself. What once felt like unstoppable growth was now unraveling rapidly, setting the stage for America's first economic collapse. By 1819, the fragile system could no longer sustain itself, and the first wave of financial panic began to spread. What had been ignored was now impossible to deny. The Second Bank of the United States reversed its policies and demanded repayment of loans across the country. Credit disappeared almost overnight. State banks followed, tightening their own lending as fear replaced confidence. The financial system began to contract rapidly. Land values collapsed as buyers vanished, leaving speculators trapped with properties they could not sell. The boom had turned into a burden. Farmers, once confident, now faced debts far greater than their income. Many realized they were on the brink of losing everything. Foreclosures spread quickly as banks seized land from those unable to repay. Entire livelihoods disappeared in a matter of weeks. The crisis reached the highest levels of government, confronting James Monroe with a problem unlike any before. There was no clear solution. Inside the National Bank, Langdon Cheves took control and attempted to restore stability. His solution was harsh but necessary. He reduced loans and tightened credit even further, hoping to save the system from total collapse. But this only deepened the suffering. Businesses failed as money became scarce and unemployment began to rise sharply. The economy was shrinking rapidly. Panic spread from cities to rural areas, affecting nearly every part of the country. No one was untouched by the downturn. What had once been optimism was now replaced with fear, as Americans struggled to understand what went wrong. The collapse felt sudden and unforgiving. Debts piled up faster than they could be paid, trapping individuals in a cycle with no clear escape. The system had turned against its own people. Banks, once seen as sources of opportunity, were now viewed as instruments of loss and control. Public trust began to erode. The crisis exposed the weakness of a system built on credit without sufficient safeguards. It was a lesson learned too late. America's first major financial collapse was now fully underway, reshaping lives across the nation. The consequences would be lasting. The same system that created prosperity had now reversed, demanding repayment from those least able to give it. The illusion was gone. And as the collapse deepened, the human cost would soon become impossible to ignore. The crisis was no longer just financial, it was personal. By mid-1819, the crisis had fully reached ordinary Americans, turning financial collapse into a daily struggle for survival. The consequences were now deeply personal. Unemployment rose sharply as businesses closed and trade slowed across towns and cities. Many found themselves without income almost overnight. Foreclosures became widespread as banks reclaimed land from those who could no longer meet their obligations. Families were forced from homes they had built. Farmers were among the hardest hit as falling crop prices left them unable to recover from mounting debts. Their livelihoods collapsed with the market. With no safety nets in place, many Americans faced poverty with little hope of immediate relief. Survival became uncertain. Debtors' prisons filled with those unable to pay what they owed, turning financial failure into physical confinement. The system offered no mercy. Communities that once thrived now struggled together, as economic hardship spread from one household to the next. No one was untouched. The crisis reshaped how Americans viewed wealth, debt, and opportunity. Trust in financial institutions began to weaken. Anger toward banks grew as many blamed them for reckless lending and sudden enforcement. Public frustration intensified. Among the voices shaped by this crisis was Andrew Jackson, who would later challenge the power of national banks. His views reflected a growing distrust. To many, the financial system now appeared to favor elites while ordinary citizens bore the consequences. The divide became more visible. Stories of loss spread quickly, reinforcing fear and uncertainty across the nation. Confidence was replaced by caution. The emotional toll of the crisis was profound, leaving many to question the system they once trusted. Recovery felt distant. Families adjusted to a new reality of scarcity, forced to rebuild from loss with limited resources. Survival required resilience. The crisis had changed the nation, exposing weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. Its impact would shape future generations. What began as financial instability had evolved into a national hardship, affecting every level of society. The effects were undeniable. The human cost of the Panic of 1819 would leave a lasting imprint on American society. It was a lesson written in hardship. And as the suffering continued, it sparked a powerful reaction that would soon reshape American politics. Change was coming. As the crisis deepened, anger spread beyond households and into the political arena, where leaders faced growing pressure to respond. The public demanded accountability. Many Americans blamed banks for reckless lending and sudden demands for repayment that triggered widespread suffering. Trust in financial institutions continued to decline. The Second Bank of the United States became a central target of criticism, seen by many as a symbol of elite control. Public resentment intensified. Political divisions grew as leaders debated the role of federal power in regulating the economy. The nation faced difficult questions about control and responsibility. At the center of this debate was the landmark case of McCulloch v. Maryland, which tested the authority of the national bank. Its outcome would be critical. Led by John Marshall, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of federal authority, strengthening the power of the national government. The decision shaped future policy. While the ruling reinforced federal control, it did little to ease the immediate suffering of the people. The gap between law and reality remained wide. State governments also responded, with some attempting relief measures to protect debtors from complete financial ruin. These efforts were limited. The crisis fueled a broader movement against centralized banking power, setting the stage for future political battles. Distrust became a defining theme. Voices like Andrew Jackson would later channel this anger into a powerful political force. The seeds of change had been planted. The relationship between government, banks, and citizens had been permanently altered by the events of 1819. Trust would not easily return. What began as an economic crisis had now reshaped American politics, setting a precedent that would echo for generations. The impact was lasting. By the early 1820s, the immediate panic began to ease, but its effects remained deeply embedded in American society. Recovery was slow and uneven across the nation. The Panic of 1819 became recognized as the nation's first major economic collapse. It revealed weaknesses few had anticipated. For the first time, Americans experienced a full boom and bust cycle driven by credit expansion and sudden contraction. The pattern was now visible. The crisis exposed the dangers of uncontrolled lending and speculation without proper safeguards. Lessons were learned, but not always remembered. Future leaders would carry these lessons forward, including figures like Andrew Jackson, who remained deeply skeptical of centralized banking power. The debate would continue. The tensions between federal authority and public trust, highlighted during McCulloch v. Maryland, would shape future economic decisions. The balance remained fragile. Although the nation recovered, the memory of widespread foreclosures and hardship lingered in the minds of its people. It became a cautionary tale. The Panic of 1819 revealed how quickly prosperity could turn into crisis when driven by unchecked optimism. Confidence alone was not enough. In the decades that followed, similar patterns would emerge again, most notably during the Great Depression. The cycle would repeat. Each crisis carried echoes of 1819, reminding the nation of the risks tied to credit, speculation, and human behavior. The lessons remained relevant. Economic systems evolve, but the forces that drive them, fear, greed, and confidence, remain unchanged. History continues to reflect these patterns. The Panic of 1819 was not just a moment in history, it was the beginning of a cycle that would shape America's economic future. And that cycle is still unfolding today.